At precisely 1 inch the morning on January 3, 2026, specialized American military units executed a landing in Caracas and took into custody a sitting head of state. This action was undertaken without a United Nations resolution or the backing of an international coalition. It involved only helicopters, restraints, and a clear signal sent to 32 other nations that the established rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. While the majority of observers perceive this event as centering on narcotics trafficking, the individual Nicolas Maduro, or the nation of Venezuela itself, they are incorrect. This event was fundamentally about a 2-century-old doctrine that has been resurrected from dormancy, and if one fails to comprehend the events of that 30-minute operation, one will fail to grasp what is about to befall an entire hemisphere. This analysis is not concerned with the morality of the action, but rather with its profound implications, because while global attention was fixed on a single individual in handcuffs, the broader strategic picture was overlooked. The United States has effectively declared that the Western Hemisphere is closed for business to all external powers except Washington, and the nation that spent 2 decades quietly constructing an economic empire across Latin America has just received an ultimatum it cannot accept. Allow me to illustrate the true nature of these events. While the United States dedicated 20 years and trillions of dollars to conflicts in the Middle East, China executed a strategy far more effective in Latin America, choosing not to invade but to invest, constructing ports, power grids, and signing contracts for lithium, copper, and iron ore, the very resources that power the modern world. By the year 2024, China's trade volume with Latin America had reached $518 billion, a figure 40 times greater than what it was in the year 2000, as China became the primary trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, Argentina, and every major economy south of the Rio Grande that holds significant importance. Then, one morning, Washington awoke to the realization that it had lost influence within its own strategic backyard. In November 2024, China inaugurated a $3.5 billion megaport in Peru that completely bypasses American shipping routes. Chinese state-owned enterprises now control the electrical grids powering major cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and Chinese firms have secured agreements for 60% of the world's lithium reserves, the critical metal that makes electric vehicle production possible. Without these South American resources, there can be no American green transition and no domestic electric vehicle industry, as Tesla, Ford, and General Motors all require what China has been quietly securing while the United States was distracted. That 30-minute operation in Caracas was not the conclusion of a sequence of events, but the commencement, and the restraints placed on Maduro served as a message that 32 other presidents have just received, raising the question of who might be next. There is a specific reason the operation occurred at 2 a.m., not merely because it was tactically optimal, but because at that hour the world is asleep, and by the time it awoke, a sitting president was already in American custody. On January 3, 2026, American helicopters landed at a military compound in Caracas, executing an operation that lasted exactly 30 minutes with no firefight and no resistance, involving only special forces, restraints, and one very surprised dictator. Within hours, Nicolas Maduro was aboard an aircraft carrier bound for the north. By sunrise, he was in American custody, and by the evening news cycle, he was confined in a Manhattan jail cell facing narco-terrorism charges. The official narrative presented Maduro as a drug trafficker and criminal who had transformed Venezuela into a narco state, asserting that the district attorney possessed a warrant and justice had been served. However, the official story omits crucial details regarding the timing, the message, and the intended audience, for this was not merely about one man. If it were solely about Maduro, he could have been apprehended years ago given that he had been under indictment since 2020, sanctions were already in place, and international isolation was complete. No, this operation occurred at this specific moment for a reason, and that reason is entirely connected to what China has been building in Latin America for the past 2 decades. Within 48 hours of Maduro's arrest, 3 significant events transpired. First, Panama's president announced a review of all Chinese contracts at the Panama Canal. Second, Bolivia's new government suspended lithium deals with Chinese companies worth $1.4 billion. And third, Brazil's foreign minister quietly canceled a state visit to Beijing. These were not coincidences, but direct responses to a message delivered with extreme clarity: neutrality is no longer an option. The arrest of Maduro was not merely law enforcement, it was geopolitics executed with restraints, serving as America's announcement that the rules of engagement in the Western Hemisphere have fundamentally changed. For 20 years, Latin American countries played both sides, accepting Chinese investment while maintaining American security ties, signing Belt and Road agreements while attending summits in Washington, enjoying the benefits of both worlds. Venezuela has just demonstrated to them what happens when that game concludes, but why now, and why did this game have to end? In 2003, when American troops were entering Baghdad, China signed an $800 million deal to modernize a port in Peru, an event nobody in Washington noticed or cared about. Yet that port is now worth $3.5 billion and handles ships too large for the Panama Canal. Allow me to show you what 20 years of distraction looks like in numbers. In 2000, China's trade with Latin America was barely $12 billion, a negligible amount representing a rounding error in global commerce. But by 2024, that number hit $518 billion. That is not mere growth, that is conquest, representing a 40-fold increase in less than a generation, and today China is the #1 trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Argentina, and every major economy in South America that produces significant goods. The United States has been displaced, but trade numbers are abstractions, so let me show you what this looks like on the ground. In November 2024, China opened the Chancay megaport in Peru, which is not merely a port but a $3.5 billion statement, a deep water facility with fully autonomous cranes capable of handling ships that cannot fit through the Panama Canal. The voyage from Shanghai to South America used to take 35 days en route through North American ports, but now it takes 23 days direct, dropping costs by 20%, leading China's ambassador to call Chancay the Shanghai of South America, while Peru's transport minister envisions it becoming the Singapore of Latin America. Here is the strategic nightmare for Washington. China and Brazil are now planning a railway connecting Chancay to the Atlantic coast, creating a transcontinental corridor and a Chinese-controlled route across South America that bypasses American infrastructure entirely. However, ports are merely the visible infrastructure. Let me tell you about the invisible infrastructure, where China's State Grid Corporation has invested $12.5 billion in Brazil's power sector. They have built ultra-high voltage transmission lines stretching 2,000 kilometers and now control critical portions of the electrical grid supplying Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, meaning if you live in Brazil's two largest cities, there is a very real chance your lights stay on because of Chinese infrastructure. In 2025, State Grid won another $3.6 billion contract, and they are planning $40 billion more by 2030. Then there is the lithium triangle, where Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile hold 60% of the world's lithium reserves, the battery metal that makes electric vehicles possible and upon which Elon Musk's entire empire depends. Bolivia alone possesses double the lithium resources of Chile, and until very recently, Bolivia's state lithium company had billion-dollar deals with China's CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, and with Russia's Uranium One. Here is the cold truth that keeps Pentagon strategists awake at night. Without South American lithium, there is no American green transition and no domestic electric vehicle industry, as Tesla, Ford, and GM all need these resources, and China has been systematically locking them up while America was spending treasure in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. The Monroe Doctrine, that 200-year-old policy stating the Western Hemisphere belongs to American influence, wasn't defeated by tanks or missiles, it was gutted by shipping containers, power lines, and lithium contracts. China understood something America forgot. Empires aren't built with aircraft carriers anymore. They are built with ports, power grids, and resource contracts, utilizing patience, capital, and the willingness to show up when others won't. While America was spreading democracy at gunpoint in the Middle East, China was spreading infrastructure in Latin America, offering no lectures about human rights and no conditions about governance, just concrete, steel, and long-term contracts. That is how you win hearts and minds in the 21st century. Not with ideology, but with investment, and that is why Trump decided the old rules no longer apply. In 1823, President James Monroe told European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. In 2026, President Donald Trump told the entire world the same thing. But there is one critical difference. Monroe was preventing colonization, while Trump is attempting recolonization. The Monroe Doctrine was born from weakness, not strength. In 1823, the United States was barely 50 years old and couldn't stop European powers from doing anything, but it could make a declaration. This hemisphere is different. Stay out or we'll consider it an act of war. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, that doctrine worked, not because America could enforce it everywhere, but because no power was willing to challenge it directly. The Soviet Union tried once in 1962 when they put missiles in Cuba. For 13 days the world held its breath while Kennedy and Khrushchev stared each other down, and ultimately the Soviets blinked, the missiles left, and the doctrine held. But then something happened. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended, America declared victory, and went looking for new enemies in new places like the War on Terror, the Middle East, and the Forever Wars. While America was gone, the doctrine went to sleep, and by 2010, China was signing deals across Latin America, and nobody in Washington thought it mattered because these were trade agreements, infrastructure projects, and development aid, not security threats or military bases, just business. But business is security when you are talking about ports that can service naval fleets, power grids that can be shut off remotely, and control over resources that modern militaries cannot function without. By 2024, American strategists finally woke up to a terrifying reality. China had built an economic empire in America's strategic backyard, and they did it while America wasn't paying attention. That is when Trump announced the Monroe Doctrine, stating that while the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Monroe Doctrine. This wasn't just ego. This was Trump articulating a fundamental shift in American foreign policy, where the Monroe Doctrine said, "Don't interfere in our hemisphere." The Monroe Doctrine says, "Choose us or face consequences." Trump's December 2025 national security strategy devoted 5 pages specifically to Latin America, more than Europe or Asia, explicitly identifying non-hemispheric competitors, meaning China, Russia, and Iran, as existential threats to American security, stating America will use leverage in finance and technology to induce countries to reject low-cost foreign assistance. Translation: Choose us or we'll destroy your economy. In April 2025, Trump announced Liberation Day, a baseline 10% tariff on virtually all imports, but the real weapon isn't tariffs, it is secondary sanctions, where countries that maintain Chinese economic relationships face escalating penalties. The message to Latin American governments is brutally simple. You can trade with China, or you can trade with us. Pick one. The old Monroe Doctrine was defensive, saying we won't let others colonize you. The new Monroe Doctrine is offensive, saying we won't let you choose anyone else, which is not protection but control. And every leader in Latin America understands the difference. There are 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 32 of them just watched what happened to number 33, and now they are doing the math on whether they are next. Mexico isn't just America's neighbor. It is America's largest trading partner and the linchpin of Chinese supply chain circumvention. As for years, Chinese companies have been building what analysts call phantom factories in Mexico, importing components from China, doing minimal assembly in Mexico, then exporting to the United States under USMCA tariff exemptions, creating a backdoor into American markets. The USMCA agreement is up for renegotiation in 2026, and Trump is demanding not just trade concessions but security cooperation that amounts to American operational control over Mexican territory, justified by cartels, fentanyl, and migration. But looking closer, the real issue is that Mexico is the last major barrier preventing complete American-Chinese economic decoupling. Under intense pressure, Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is advancing legislation to impose tariffs up to 50% on Chinese goods, specifically to prevent Beijing from using Mexico as a workaround. But here is the leverage Trump holds. He has threatened to designate Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations, which is not symbolic but would give the U.S. military legal authority to conduct operations inside Mexico with or without Mexican consent. Mexico is between a rock and a hard place. Comply fully or face the possibility of American military operations on your soil. Brazil presents a different challenge, as this isn't Venezuela or a failed state with a collapsing economy. Brazil is the world's ninth largest economy with the Amazon, oil, and agricultural exports that both America and China desperately need, and President Lula has made clear Brazil will not choose sides. Here is the question everyone should be asking. Why won't China just leave, cut losses, avoid confrontation, and let America have its backyard back? The answer is brutally simple. China can't, because China's economy is structured around two things: manufacturing exports and resource imports, taking raw materials from around the world, transforming them in Chinese factories, and selling finished products globally. That model requires massive, steady, reliable flows of resources: iron ore for steel, copper for electronics, lithium for batteries, oil for energy. And China doesn't have these resources domestically in the quantities needed to sustain 1.4 billion people and the world's second-largest economy, so they import them. For the past 2 decades, Latin America has been the solution, with Brazil supplying the iron ore that feeds Chinese steel mills, without which China's construction sector grinds to a halt. Chile provides the copper that goes into every electronic device China manufactures, without which the electronics industry collapses. Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile hold 60% of the world's lithium, without which China's electric vehicle industry dies. These aren't luxuries or negotiable. These are existential inputs to the Chinese economic model, and if America successfully forces Latin America to choose, and Latin America mostly chooses America, then China faces resource strangulation, not immediately or catastrophically, but slowly and steadily, as the raw materials that feed Chinese industry become more expensive, harder to access, and subject to American approval, which is unacceptable to Beijing. When great powers collide, small nations suffer. That is not cynicism, that is history. And Latin America is about to learn that lesson again. Let me take you back to another era, Chile, in 1973, where Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist president, is pursuing closer ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union. The Nixon administration decides this is unacceptable. The CIA backs a military coup. Allende dies. General Pinochet takes power, and thousands are tortured and killed, justified by preventing Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just about Venezuela. It is about 33 countries, and forcing a choice that nobody wanted to make. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the outcome couldn't be less certain. This story is just beginning, and somewhere tonight in presidential palaces from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, 32 leaders are looking in the mirror and asking themselves the same question: am I next?